This week we're going to talk about race, ethnicity, and class and address identity. This week we're going to talk about race, ethnicity, and class and discuss the formation of identity and social inequality. Specifically asking if differences of identity are not rooted in biology, why do they feel so real, so powerful, and unchangeable? So the first question that we have to get out of the way is there any biological basis for race? Is race even remotely biological? And so race certainly in America feels inevitable and natural. The categories and strategies, though, that are used in stratified societies, America notwithstanding, that uphold the social order are as constructed and dynamic as any other cultural processes. So, for example, we've had some medications that have been developed specifically for and tested on African Americans, but those drugs are equally effective for anyone. Human hearts, for example, don't come in distinct types that correlate with skin color. A human heart is a human heart. That being said, there certainly are some underlying health issues that seem to have an association with race, but a lot of that is mediated through historical racism, systemic racism, and this inequality that arises across social strata. So, in America, at least, it's really hard, and this is true the world over, it's really hard to distinguish racial issues, ethnic issues from class issues because we've very much got this pattern of um, forcing ethnic minorities into lower social strata. All right, so African American might be a relevant category. For marketers, race is not a cause of biological differences. Since the 18th century, European and American scientists have attempted to divide the world, to divide human variability, specifically in noticeable phenotypes. Most notable, of course, skin color, though there are other quote unquote racial markers, including hair texture, including shape of the nose. Anyway, scientists have tried to divide human variability into subspecies or races like zoologists do with other animals. These racial typologies share a fundamental flaw. There are no quote unquote racial markers or racial genes. There are no diagnostic genes or genetic traits that belong to only one racial group and not to any others. And so, if we just look to our closest relatives, or some of our closest relatives, and we look specifically among orangutans. Orangutans have now been, there are two different species of orangutans, those that live on the island of Borneo, those that live on the island of Sumatra. And those orangutans used to be considered two subspecies, but they have what's called a chromosomal inversion. That is, chromosome 14, it's either 14 or 16, I can't remember which. One of the chromosomes basically has turned itself upside down so that it's in reverse order in the human genetic code. So those are markers that really give us that insight into distinct biologically meaningful differences. Those markers in other species can be morphology. It can be, an anatomical characteristics, coloration, one elaborated trait. They can be genetic, like this chromosome shift that we see between these two groups of orangutans. They can be related to the songs they sing. There have been species of tarsiers in Africa that have been subdivided now into like 16 different subspecies based on differences in their song. We have none of those. As a species, we have no markers that distinguish between quote unquote distinct races. And so historically, people have been categorized across basically five human races based on traits, based predominantly on skin color, and then secondarily on hair and nose. Johann Friedrich Blumenbach identified these five races and classified them as Mongoloid, Caucasoid, Negroid, Malayan, and American Indian. Similarly, our folk taxonomy in the US divides people into vibrant colors that exaggerate the range of human skin tones. This has been, I think of my Southern Baptist upbringing and the song that children's church would always put, Jesus loves the human children, all the children of the world, that would categorize people into red, yellow, black, and white, right? So we have a historical approach that we're in more modern times we're recognizing doesn't really fit the distinctions between the beautiful array of colors that human skin tone can take. There are few, if any, people who are truly black, white, red, or yellow. I mean, white would be what, albino? Um, all of these terms have been used to describe human skin pigmentation. In reality, we're all clustered within a pretty narrow range of colors, what anthropologist Nina Jablonski calls a sepia rainbow. It used to be that Crayola boxes had one skin tone that they called flesh that was based on, white people's skin. Right now, we've got the wonderful recognition of a wide variety of browns that fall under the rainbow of skin color. So, we're recognizing this. We're at least making a concerted effort to represent more diversity. There have been articles that have really depicted that rather than see these really big differences in skin color that historically have been in place, and we're going to talk about the why of that in a few minutes, that states that in another 30 to 50 years, our skin color is going to be less different than it has been historically because of the fact that we've got a lot of what we would consider racial admixture, right? We've got people of mixed races having children with people of other mixed races, and that leads to a lot of intermediate kind of sepia tones. All right, so Carlos Linnaeus, who's kind of the father of modern day taxonomy, identified 4 human races that were based on geographic origin. These include African, Asian, American, and European. The obvious weakness of this model is that continents have vast, tremendous ethnic diversity. If we think about Africa, for example, we've got a range of skin colors. We've got a huge amount of ethnic variability. Asia is an extensive continent, going from the Eurasian steppes and areas in Southwest Asia like the Levant, the Middle East, all the way over to China and Japan. So we see naturalized racial groupings within continents. So when we distinguish between these geographical origins of quote unquote races, we then inevitably have to divide and subdivide. And this is a futile attempt. We're not going to be able to really account for the true variability of our species through such broad racial groupings. Race, at least in the scope of skin color, and truly these other morphological features too, nose shape, hair texture, etc., is adaptive. Skin color is adaptive, at least historically. And so we'll talk about this adaptational approach to race that links these physical traits with the environment. And we recognize that prior to European colonialism, we saw what was called a cline. A cline is kind of a geographic spectrum of how traits can be expressed. And then specifically with respect to skin color, we note that darkest skin colors appear in the equatorial regions. And as you move toward either pole, either northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere, skin color lightens. So clearly, skin color has a relationship with some biological adaptation, and it's mediated through exposure to UV radiation. So we see a correlation between latitude and skin pigmentation. We also see an effect of density of forest cover, such that in some equatorial regions, we've got much lighter skin among populations that live in dense tropical rainforest, and much darker skin among populations that live out in more open or savanna type habitats. So the strength of looking at it from an adaptational approach is that we can identify actual biological patterns. So we can see distinctly what the function is of these various expressions of basically melanin production and melanin density. The weakness is that this pigmentation varies along a continuum. So any lines that designate racial identity are arbitrary. There's no clear distinction where one race begins or one race ends and another one begins. All right, so looking at this particular map that comes from Augustine Fuentes' biological anthropology book, we see that darkest skin tones center around the equatorial regions, and specifically the equatorial regions in Africa. That those that have the lightest skin pigmentation, we're talking about the Norwegian, the Scandinavian kind of peninsula, Norway, Sweden, etc. We see a decline along the New World as well, but it's mediated a lot more through kind of elevation and kind of forest exposure. And the lack of the variability that we see in the New World has more to do with the relatively recent peopling of the New World. And so specifically populations moved from Northeast Asia into the New World only about 20,000 years ago. Interestingly, there is also evidence that the very light skin that we find among people that inhabit or have historically inhabited Scandinavia is also a relatively new phenomenon, and specifically that light skin, the blonde hair, the blue eyes that we associate with like the mythical Swedish supermodel, those are the result of a founder effect. And really it was simply because by chance alone, more light-skinned, blonde-haired, blue-eyed people settled Scandinavia than did darker-skinned, brown-eyed, brown-haired people. All right, so really quick, I mean, we're not going to focus on this for the bulk of the lecture because we are not a biological anthropology class, right? We are a cultural anthropology class. But what is the function of darker skin? Well, the color of skin is mediated through melanin, and we've got specific cells that are called melanocytes that produce melanin, and there are both more and larger melanocytes with a higher concentration of melanin in darker skinned people. What this does is gives them a protection, an innate protection against the dangerous effects of UV radiation, such that where UV radiation is high, darker skin is present, and that darker skin is associated with lower rates of metastatic skin cancer, for example, like melanoma. That lighter skinned people in tropical areas have a harder time. There's a lot more UV damage. They burn. They also have higher rates of skin cancer. UV radiation is also tied to vitamin D production, and critically, dark-skinned people that live at higher latitudes run a risk of subclinical vitamin D deficiencies because their skin's not able to produce a high enough level of vitamin D. And so lighter skin confers an advantage in areas with less sun exposure, with low UV, because it allows for that skin to make enough vitamin D. Vitamin D deficiencies have been associated with an increased risk of COVID, increased risk of cancer, increased risk of heart disease and diabetes, etc. So another mechanism by which skin color is associated with health and wellness is through vitamin D production. The third adaptive function of differences in melanin production and melanin concentration relates to the conservation of folate. And so if you are a woman of reproductive age, if you've had sisters who have had babies, if you have significant others who've had babies, you know that folate is a really big deal during fetal development. A lack of folate is associated with neural tube defects, so things like spina bifida, things like acephaly, things like the spinal cord and nerve bundles not being entirely enclosed in the neural tube and in the vertebral column. That's associated with paralysis, with developmental delays, with risk of death, etc. So what melanin production does is conserves folate because UV radiation breaks down folate. And so particularly in areas with high UV radiation, there is a benefit to having darker skin in that it makes populations less likely to develop neural tube defects among their offspring. So there are adaptational approaches that pinpoint a relationship between skin color and UV exposure and the various pathways through which that is mediated that give an advantage to darker skin in equatorial regions, lower latitudes, and lighter skin at higher latitudes. All right, so a fourth approach to categorizing races defines races as reproductively isolated breeding populations. One other thing I just want to bring up is that race is a valid biological term in other species. If we look at taxonomy, race specifically refers to, it's a subspecies level designation. So you go from genus to species to race. And from the perspective of human evolution, the last time that we had distinct races was when Neanderthals and Denisovans were still walking the earth with us. So we're talking about no more recent than about 45,000 years ago. So Neanderthals, from a biological and taxonomical perspective, would be considered a race of Homo sapiens. All right, so the strength of this approach is that it realistically accounts for some of the sociocultural factors that influence mate selection. I mean, if your breeding population is isolated, you're going to be limited in what you have to choose from in your available mating partners. The weakness is that it creates a prohibitively large number of races. So, with the COVID outbreak, one of the areas that is particularly susceptible is the Amazon, right? Because we've got a large number of what we call quote unquote uncontacted tribes. They're not really uncontacted, but they are isolated populations, isolated tribes. By this reproductively isolated breeding population, each one of those tribes has the potential to be considered a separate race. So that's not realistic, right? And we use instead the term ethnicity to reflect historically rather isolated breeding populations. So if you come from a cultural heritage that in particular had a practice that we call endogamy, which means marrying or reproducing within your social group, then you've got more genetic markers that you share. Then you might see the development of some of these particular quote unquote ethnic markers. So, for example, Tay Sachs disease in Ashkenazi Jews, that is an ethnic marker that reflects a historically isolated breeding population. So whether there are 4 races or 1,000 based on arbitrary designations, the use of race oversimplifies a very complex reality. So there are a number of problems that come out of trying to structure the world into specific races. These typologies don't describe any actual individuals. They don't even characterize whole groups of people. They try to, right? That's their justification. But they exclude a lot of the really interesting variability that we find among people. Racial thinking equates one visible trait, such as skin color, to complex behavioral attributes like intelligence, like athletic ability, or like personal character. So let's think of some racial stereotypes that are prevalent in the US. right? Intelligence, that was certainly a justification of European imperialism. This notion that indigenous populations were somehow inferior, savage, etc., less capable of complex thought. There is still systemic institutional racism in the science fields, for example. How many neuroscientists are African American, right? How many Black PhDs in astrophysics? I mean, we've got Neil deGrasse Tyson, thankfully. I sometimes I liken that man to a god, not literally, but just the degree to which he's got people talking about some really interesting scientific issues. But he's an anomaly. You know, it's not a field where you have equity and representation, right? So we absolutely associate racial characteristics with intelligence, athletic ability, right? You want to play in the NBA? What's going to be true about you? Well, first of all, you better be no shorter than about 6'2", 6'3", right? But typically, I mean, there was a movie in the, I don't remember whether it was the 80s or 90s, my teenage and young college years kind of all run together, but the movie White Men Can't Jump, right? So we've got the stereotype that that basketball is predominated by Black men, that football is predominated by Black men, that you know we have this. I mean, we can even look to like high school volleyball being dominated by tall Scandinavian ancestry women, right? White girls with blonde hair. I mean, you go to some of the, my daughter plays high school volleyball. So you go to some of the club tournaments, and particularly when you look at the teams from anywhere in the Midwest, most of their lineup is 6 foot tall, lithe, blonde women, right? So we associate skin color with athletic ability, personal characteristics. I mean, this is what's at the crux of the Black Lives Matter movement, right? A lot of white people assume that Black people are thugs, that Black people have a more criminal element. We have overrepresentation of particularly Black men in prison populations. Does this mean that Black men um, participate more in crime and commit more crime? Well, that's a really sticky kind of situation to disentangle. They certainly are accused of more crime. They certainly are punished more harshly for the crimes that they are accused of. So if you look at sentences for rape, for example, Brock Turner got 6 months so that it wouldn't, quote unquote, ruin his life, right? If it were a Black man who had committed that rape, they would have been incarcerated for much, much longer. We've got racial profiling that immediately assumes that Black men are committing acts of criminal intent. But we also have a really complex relationship between race and socioeconomic status. And so we've got large proportions of our Black population that are growing up in inner city, low socioeconomic status populations. And if you just look to Albuquerque at the regions of the city that are lower socioeconomic status, if we talk about the International District and we talk about the South Valley, both of those are characterized by higher rates of poverty. Well, what comes with higher rates of poverty? More criminal activity. Oftentimes because there's no other outlet. There's no way to legitimately earn the money that you need to be able to support your family. So you turn to criminal activity, or you grow up in that kind of environment. You're desensitized to it. It's what people do as they get older. So we can't really accept, though these stereotypes in the US have been supported by skewed data over the past 200 years. There's nothing inherent about different races with regards to their personal character, right? With regards to any of their cultural abilities. Each one of us is an expression of thousands of genetically based traits. The ones that we still use to determine race aren't especially important. they do share one common characteristic. They are very visually obvious. And so this is really what's at the crux of systemic racism in the United States, right? And it comes out of our history of European colonialism. We divide humans into groups based on blood type, right? Do we have any gangs of negatives out there, right? We can classify them or divide them based on fingerprint patterns. These things make biological sense, but we don't give them racial significance. One really important statistic to keep in the back of your mind is that when we're looking at biologically meaningful traits, disease risk, blood type, routes of metabolism, etc., there's more variation within races than there is between races, meaning that everyone who's got, who's classified as black, like we see a huge amount of variability among blacks. We don't see that same huge amount of variability between blacks and whites. Okay, so this essentially tells us that our racial categories are bunk. There's nothing biologically meaningful about them. Now, that doesn't negate their social meaning. Race is biologically meaningless, but it's very real. Race does have some biological consequences, let's say skin cancer rates, but it most definitely has huge cultural consequences. And so, a quote from Gravely: to say that race is a cultural construct is not to say it doesn't exist. Cultural constructs have an objective reality despite their reliance on human thoughts. So anything that we culturally construct, be it race, be it gender, be it sexuality, right, we ascribe very real meaning to that. Religion, is another one there. So, for example, there are significant differences in the rates of disease and the average lifespan between different racial groupings in the United States. We could look at maternity outcomes. We have an almost double to triple the rate of poor outcomes of black mothers and their babies than we do white mothers and their babies. Is that because there's some biological deficit that black mothers face? No, it's because systemic racism, a history of racism and discrimination have led to those problems, whether it's simply a matter of how they're treated in the labor and delivery ward, or whether it's an effect of growing up in poverty that sets your metabolism and sets your fight or flight response at a different level of sensitivity, whether it's a matter of inherited trauma. There is an abundance of evidence that is pointing to inherited trauma as a real epigenetic risk or factor. What do we mean by epigenetic? Well, epi means above, and genetic, of course, means genetic. Your things determined by your DNA. And so epigenetic factors are those that are above the level of inherited differences in your DNA. And so there's evidence that survivors of the Holocaust, that their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren still bear genetic markers of that trauma, and that's mediated through the intrauterine environment, not through a change in the actual composition of genes. What happens is environmental characteristics, as mediated through the intrauterine environment, set those patterns of gene expression to be different. We see the same effect of the descendants of slaves in the United States. So there is inherited trauma that changes gene expression. That can lead to different disease risks. There is trauma that's experienced within the lifespan of the individual that leads to different disease risk. And there's acute trauma that occurs at the moment that a critical health crisis is happening that affects the ability of an individual to kind of cope with and heal from that acute health crisis. So all of these add together to some very meaningful differences in health outcomes and disease risk, etc., between blacks and whites. All right, so we'll take our first pause here, thinking critically about race, ethnicity, and class. The idea that racial differences are genetically and biologically determined is widely accepted by the US public. The contrary and more complicated view that we just presented has failed to gain widespread traction even as it offers a more empirically valid understanding of the relationship between race and biology. How would you, as a burgeoning anthropologist, how would you communicate these ideas and findings to the broader public? In other words, how do we overcome and compensate for several hundred years of systemic racism, right? I mean, what is it that's so scary about us being one race, the human race? A lot of what drives it is people being afraid to lose power, right? Who's got the most at risk? Well, it's going to be white men. And after that, it will be white women. I don't know if any of you have read the book White Fragility, but this gets to the core of some of these issues that plague America, is that we have a population that's historically been in power. If you look to our founding fathers, most of them were European colonists. Most of them have been white. You look at the economic variability prior to the Civil War, for example, right? And you've got wealthy white industrialists that drove a lot of the economic decision making in our country that utilize race to suppress an entire class of individuals, to force them into lower socioeconomic status. Right? Then we have our historical civil rights movement. We've got Jim Crow laws. We've got the race riot in Tulsa. We've got modern day racial profiling. Like how do we overcome that? White people are scared to lose their power, particularly older wealthy white men are scared to lose their power. What makes that so scary? How do we move beyond our history of systemic racism? Right? This is certainly something to think about and something that needs to be an active part of our everyday conversation.